Hello, and welcome back to Bad Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at Bad Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. When you talk with people today, it's not unusual for there to be a certain kind of fatalism in the air, a sense that things are only getting worse. But spend time with Bitcoiners and you feel the opposite. Energy, optimism, even excitement for the future. What are they seeing the others aren't? That's the question I put to Seb Bunney. He's the author of The Hidden Cost of Money, a book on Bitcoin that doesn't delve into the technical aspects of Bitcoin like mining or the blockchain, but rather dives into something deeper, the problem Bitcoin was designed to solve. Seb argues that our money itself is broken. Inflation, devaluation, and distorted incentives ripple throughout all aspects of our lives. Bitcoin, he says, flips those incentives and points us towards a deflationary world, one that rewards saving, innovation, and long-term thinking. It's a disruptive idea, and one that not only challenges the central banks and financial sector, but the very debt-based model our societies run on. In our conversation, Seb lays out why he believes Bitcoin is not just another tech fad, but a tool for human thriving that once unleashed may prove to be unstoppable. Seb Bunney is the author of 2 books on Bitcoin, The Hidden Cost of Money and B is for Bitcoin. He's also the co-founder of Looking Glass Education. I'll post all his relevant links in the show notes. And quick point of clarification, I specifically sought out a Bitcoiner for this conversation as they draw a sharp line between Bitcoin and the wider crypto market. All right, let's talk Bitcoin with Seb Bunney. Seb Bunney, welcome to Bad Canadians.
Oh man, I appreciate you having me on. And as I mentioned at the start, I think there's not enough people that are standing up for what they believe in and sharing their thoughts. And so I just really appreciate people that are open to dialogue and being curious.
Oh, well, thank you for coming on here. And I've really enjoyed your book. I finished it a couple of days ago. Really. How long did it take you to write that?
You know what? It's an interesting one because I would say it took me a year in total to go from idea to kind of having a proper draft, fully edited and kind of ready for publishing. But the actual initial first version of it only took 2 weeks.
Oh.
And it was because at the time, my dog had like a gut issue and she was waking up every 2 hours at night. And it's interesting. There's a lot of studies that look into this, but that moment just as you wake up, sometimes you're kind of like, you have these downloads, you have this information that kind of comes to you. And I ended, for this 2-week period, I kept on waking up. The dog needed to go to the bathroom. And I'd be like, I think chapter 1 needs to be this. And then I wake up again that same night. Chapter 2, these are the key points of chapter 2. And then I wake up again. Chapter 3 and 4 needs to be bridged through this way. And so between the hours of 1 and 5 in the morning, I wrote 95% of the book across a 2-week span. And then it took me a year to fill in all of the pieces and kind of add all the supporting evidence and such. But I very much believe sometimes it doesn't feel like it's my book. It feels like I've downloaded the book. But I feel really lucky to have been able to put that out there.
Well, yeah, it's an amazing contribution, and it does feel like your book to me because it is very personal too. You have a little personal story, in there that comes through. Your voice comes through for a subject that's really complicated and can be overwhelming. You make it very approachable and easy to read, and it was a good read. It was. I actually thought I'd start us off here with reading a couple quotations.
Totally.
From your book. It's just this first one is a quote. Both quotes from your book. This one's from the famous English philosopher and physician John Locke, who was alive in the 1600s. And so the quote is, financiers would benefit at the expense of widows and orphans. Wealth would be redistributed from savers to borrowers. Creditors would be inadequately compensated for risk. Too much borrowing would take place. Money would flow abroad in search of higher returns. Asset price inflation would make the rich richer. The reduction of interest rates wouldn't revive a moribund, approaching death economy. In short, forced reduction in interest rates imparts no benefit to a society. And the second quote I like to say is from Thomas Jefferson, who was alive in the 1700s. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs. And so I wanted to start with those quotes because I think, for a lot of people who just hear about Bitcoin, haven't taken the dive in to learn about it yet. I think Bitcoin still maybe is seen as that, the magic computer money. And it's something that was kind of randomly discovered online and we're just kind of shopping around for a use for it. And I don't think people appreciate that it's a very specific piece of technology that was built to be a solution to a very specific problem. And I think that problem is what John Locke and Thomas Jefferson were. It's arguably a centuries old problem. And so I was wondering if you could maybe start with that and just what is the problem that Bitcoin is trying to solve?
Totally. And, it's really interesting you bring up those points, because I think that the challenge with Bitcoin is that a lot of people have an aversion to it. It's used for illicit activity. It's boiling the ocean. There's a lot of these narratives that have been spun, and therefore the moment people hear it, they disregard it. And I think what's really important with anything, whether we're teaching about Bitcoin, whether we're teaching about mountain biking, whether we're teaching about you name it, is for someone to try and understand a solution, they first need to grok the problem. Mm-hmm. Because if you try and offer someone a solution to something they don't understand, it's not going to make any sense. And so I think a lot of people don't quite understand that a lot of the challenges we face in society actually stem from money, whether it is rising house prices, whether it is parents not having enough time to be able to spend time with their kids, whether it is the consumerism that we see in society, people just living to spend as opposed to kind of saving and thinking about the future. I would argue most of this stems from broken money. And so when you start to see this, then it's like, well, what would a money look like in order to solve these problems? And that's what I want to try and argue throughout my book, The Hidden Cost of Money, that Bitcoin is the solution to broken money. It's the solution to money that loses purchasing power, which results in all of these hidden costs to society. And so maybe just kind of step back for a second and let's just connect the dots, because I think that it can be a little hard, again, understanding the problem. The way I think about money at a very, very high level is like language, money is a medium of expression. It's how we express to the world what we value monetarily. So if you go into a grocery store and you see someone buying grass-fed beef and organic vegetables, and then you go and see someone going and buying microwave meals and cigarettes, you can see what they value by where they direct their money. And what is interesting is when you have a cohesive society, if you take a very high-level view, where money flows in society highlights what it is that society values. And so in a pure free market, if someone creates a product and society values that product, money will flow to that individual. But the problem is in a centralized market, we don't have that. We don't have anything close to that. And the problem is we have central bankers, we have regulatory bodies that put capital controls in place that basically say you can buy these, but you can't buy these. Or you cannot invest overseas. We want to keep the money inside the economy so we can devalue it, so we can maximize our chances of survival. We're going to devalue the currency, so you can't necessarily go and direct your capital into the things that you see fit. If you believe in supporting your family, you believe in being able to support your community, and in order to do that, you need to preserve your purchasing power, well, the government can put capital controls in place to prevent you from investing in certain aspects so that you can actually preserve that purchasing power. So as money is losing value, it's actually impacting how people express themselves. It's impacting their ability to direct their capital to what they see fit. And if we take that analogy and then we look at it for childhood expression rather than monetary expression, but childhood expression, what we start to see is if as a child, my parents didn't let me experience certain emotions like anger or frustration or sadness. These are just emotions. There's no such thing as a negative emotion. If our parents didn't let us experience certain emotions, what would happen is later in life, if we feel those emotions, we don't know what to do with them, and it leads to depression. Depression is the depressing of emotions. Well, I would argue that, again, those points that I brought up, whether it's the housing issues, the family issues as a result of money and stress, whether it's consumerism, they stem from an inability for people to express themselves monetarily because our monetary system doesn't allow us to express ourselves. And so that's a bit of a little random rant, but I'll kind of end it in a few, kind of ground it in three different examples. So we first spoke about houses. What's interesting is houses and farmland, these were originally kind of created as things that provide utility. They allow us to put a roof over our heads. They allow us to thrive. Farmland, it allows us to grow crops. It allows us to support our community. The problem is when money starts losing value, people now need to go and preserve that value somewhere else. So what do? They leave the currency and they go and invest in things like real estate. They go and invest in things like farmland. Well, that then drives up the price of those assets artificially because people are no longer using it for their utility purpose. They're simply using it to store value. So it then takes these assets that were once assets for society that could be used to support families and food and communities, and then it simply turns them into a store of value. And I lived in Whistler for a long time, the ski resort of Whistler, and 61% of houses are empty in Whistler. Like, this is mind-blowing. We have a housing crisis and 61% of houses are empty. And it's because wealthy individuals, and it's no fault of the wealthy individuals recognize, I'm not going to store my purchasing power in currency. I'm going to go and store my purchasing power in something that at least somewhat preserves my purchasing power. So they go and put it in real estate, driving up the prices and taking those properties off the market. And so that's the first thing. Things like real estate, things like farmland become inaccessible to the average individual. The second thing is kind of like the family unit. We can dive into these things more, but just as a high level, what we've seen in Canada from the 1970s to 2015, we've seen a doubling of dual earner households and a halving of single earner households. So that's where both parents having to go out and work versus one parent going and being able to support the family. And I would argue that it's because our cost of living has skyrocketed. The average house in Canada has gone from 3 times the average person's wage to 9 times the average person's wage. So both parents having to go out and work. And that means parents are spending less time with their kids. Their kids aren't necessarily getting the emotional regulation and support they need. And so it's no wonder we're seeing rising rates of depression and anxiety and substance abuse, suicide, things like this. And it's because kids don't have their emotional needs met because both parents having to go out and work. And then finally, it's kind of like the consumerist side of things. When we think about consumerism, a lot of people are just like, well, it's just millennials. It's just the individual, they've got bad habits. But the reality is that when our money is losing value over time, as opposed to staying still in purchasing power or appreciating, there's an underlying incentive. The underlying incentive is that it's actually in our best interest to spend that money right now because the purchasing power is greatest in the present moment. So if the purchasing power is greatest in the present moment and I'm incentivized to spend, that leads to a consumerist society. It leads to a society where people are just going and spending, buying whatever it is to fill that immediate gratification. And so you end up with kind of a bit of a soulless society. And the repercussions of that consumerism are a decimation of our natural environment because consumption requires resources. Resources come from our forests, our waterways, you name it. And so we're kind of decimating our natural environment as a result of our consumption habits, as a result of money losing value, incentivizing us to consume. Anyway, I've just rambled at you. Hopefully that's made some sense.
Oh, that was great. Yeah, no, and I maybe I'll drill in on a couple of things there. I'm just, when I hear you say all that stuff, I guess, maybe from a non-Bitcoiner perspective, like, when you say broken money, like, so you're talking as in, like, is the key thing that Bitcoin has that fixed 21 million, so it's not going to deflate? Is that the idea, is to create, when you say broken money, you're saying money that doesn't depreciate? Is that the key thing that is different here? Yeah.
Totally. That's a really, really good point. And again, like, I think it takes a little bit of explaining as to the foundation and the problem. And so the problem is, when I talk about broken money, and I could say that actually money is doing exactly what it's intended to do. It just depends on who you're looking at. Are you looking at the consumer, the user of the money, or are you looking at those that issue the money? Those that issue the money are the biggest debtors in the world. So if our governments, our central banks, which have taken on all this debt, they need to devalue that debt to reduce its burden. So in their eyes, it's working exactly as it should. As money loses value, the debt burden reduces. But to savers, to individuals that are trying to survive, that broken money that's losing purchasing power means life is getting harder. Things are getting more expensive. And unfortunately, wages aren't keeping up. And so I think what's really important to note is that, and before kind of touching on the Bitcoin point, is that our society is inherently deflationary. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that naturally people, they always want to strive to get more for less. We always want to innovate. We always want to become more efficient. And so take something like the apple. If we go back 150 years, to be able to bring an apple to market, what would you have to do? You would have to grow that crop, but you could only grow during the summer months. During the winter months, you can't really harvest, the apples aren't growing. And then you'd have to watch that crop during the summer months, during the prime months, to make sure that birds don't peck at it. You had to make sure the bugs and the aphids, whatever, didn't destroy the crop. And then you had to go pick them all by hand. and then you had to put them on a cart, and then you had to take them to market. But you could only go by horse and cart, so you were very limited. It was a very time-intensive thing to get one apple. Well, today, because of human ingenuity, because of technology, we're able to grow year-round in greenhouses. We have pesticides and herbicides, which I don't agree with, but we have pesticides and herbicides to reduce crop loss. We have the ability to genetically modify these things to increase yield, which I don't agree with, but we can. And we then have airplanes and refrigeration, so we can sell to a global market. So you would think that the efficiency, amount of energy that goes into growing one apple now is significantly less than it was 150 years ago. So we're able to massively increase the volume of apples, yet at the same time, over the last 150 years, apples have increased by 1,500%. And so you wonder, like, why, if our efficiency to produce something, why, if our efficiency is increased, has price increased? Should it not be the reverse? And it's because at the same time, we've been expanding the money supply quicker than efficiency is driving down prices. So we actually never realize human ingenuity. We never realize human technology driving down prices. So we never benefit from it. Instead, life gets harder, even as society should be getting easier because we're able to do things more efficiently. And so what's interesting about Bitcoin, and I'd say it's one of the most like core foundational pieces about Bitcoin is scarce. There's only 21 million. And so even after Bitcoin has gone through its adoption phase, let's just say every single person in the world was using it. What's really interesting is because humans are always striving to get more for less, we're always increasing efficiency, technological advancement, there's always going to be more goods and services in society. If it's all denominated in a fixed supply of units, then over time prices fall. And so what that means is for everybody, whether you're talking about the elites or someone on the street, life starts to get easier. And so I think that in a world where prices fall, we flip a lot of the incentives of society. All of a sudden, rather than having our aperture of awareness narrow as we become more fearful and more stressed, our aperture of awareness starts to widen. If we made a few poor decisions in our teenage years and our 20s, all of a sudden, when we get back on track, it becomes a lot easier for us to make those right decisions to be able to build prosperity and save for a family. If we do find ourselves on the street, would you rather live in a world where prices are falling or prices are rising? And so I think that I would argue that Bitcoin at its foundational core, because of the scarcity of 21 million, it supports this deflationary nature where prices should fall over time, and it makes life so much more prosperous for everyone. Life is so much easier.
Right, okay, and so going back to this, the consumerism, we're always knocking consumerism. We're always, but yet, in your book, like I guess the claim is made that this is intentional, that, like you said earlier, that inflation is occurring, the cost of money is getting greater than the deflationary pressures. And so I guess that's another thing I think people are skeptical or maybe unaware of, is that inflation is an intentional monetary policy. Mm-hmm. And so that, the Bitcoin method would be reversing that, I guess, the idea that, like, how is that a true statement, that inflation is a monetary policy that is done on purpose?
So it's a challenging one, because I think there's always going to be a little bit of an assumption. But if you look at the incentives of the system in the way that it is set up benefits from inflation. And so we just need, as I mentioned earlier, take a step back and say, okay, if we look at the system and we have this huge debt-based system, what does the debt-based system benefit from? And what it benefits from is a devaluation of currency. Because the more you devalue that currency, the more you devalue that debt. Well, the biggest debtor in the world is usually the nation state. There's a central bank. And so they benefit from a devaluation of currency. On top of that, on a debt-based system, you need to incentivize spending, the continuous spending. And so I think that as you get the devaluation of currency, as I mentioned earlier, it incentivizes consumerism. As it incentivizes consumerism, we're seeing the flow of money, which lubricates this debt-based system. But the problem is that debt-based system cannot go on indefinitely. There was a really interesting report that was done, when was it? Maybe it was in like 2010, 2015, by a big research firm called McKinsey. And McKinsey looked back throughout history at all of the nations that went over 120% debt to GDP. And what they realized is out of the 52 nations that had done that, 51 of them had basically led into hyperinflation. And so it makes you wonder, like, there's kind of this point of no return. When you've taken on too much debt, it's almost impossible to pay down. And the only nation that had not gone under is Japan. And Japan is now the most indebted nation in the world. Well, we take a look at Canada, and Canada right now is the second most indebted nation in the world. Going into the pandemic, we were actually one of the more fiscally responsible nations, but Trudeau decided to just completely decimate that, and alongside Carney, and we're now in this position where we've borrowed far beyond our means. And you can mathematically prove that we cannot pay ourselves out of this situation. And the way to do that is, so Canada, if you look at your total debt includes corporate debt, household debt, and government debt. So if you look at total debt, we know total debt is 422% of GDP. Now, debt, as everyone knows, usually has an interest rate. Well, that interest rate, let's just be conservative, and I think it's a lot higher than this, but let's just say that interest rate is 3%. If debt is 4.2 times bigger than GDP, you multiply 3% by 4.2 times, it gives us 12.66%. What that means is that GDP, so the economy has to grow by 12.66% a year just to pay the interest on the debt. Well, how fast has Canada grown in the last 100 years on average? It's grown 0.76%, not even 1%, not even 1% a year. And we need to be growing at 12.6% just to be paying the interest on that debt, which then highlights that we are in a debt spiral. It means that every year we have to borrow more money to pay off the debt that we previously borrowed. And if the only way to do that is to print more money, then we're going to continually experience a devaluation of currency. So as we experience more and more of a devaluation of currency, we're going to continue to see inflation. We're going to continue to see rising house prices. We're going to continue to see rising cost of living. And that's where I think people are wondering, why does Bitcoin keep going up? And the reason why is because Bitcoin is a fixed asset with fixed supply against all of these other currencies with unlimited supply that are going to continually be devalued because the system incentivizes such behavior. And I would say, like we talk about this idea, you ask the question, is it intentional? Well, if you look at the definition of inflation, and I wrote about this in the Hidden Cost of Money, I don't know if you picked up on it. If you look at the definition of inflation, I think it was pre-1970s, it used to be inflation is a rise in prices as a result of an increase in the money supply. And then post-1970s, they changed the definition. They said inflation is a rise in prices. What they did is they removed the trigger. They removed the thing that causes it. And what that enables the government to go and do is then go and say something like, you know what, we're going to create the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to print $4.2 trillion to fix inflation. So it's like, you can't print money to fix inflation. That is the cause of inflation. And so it's interesting that it's deception through changing definitions.
Right. I feel like I'm barely a Bitcoiner. I feel like I'm a Bitcoiner in that I have a friend who has a story similar to yours. I think grew up kind of in poverty with like a single parent, and basically is like, no thanks, that's not the life I want, and became hyper focused on finance, self-sufficiency, taking care, and became a financial whiz. I kind of had the opposite experience. You know, my dad did that. He grew up poor and was like, not for me. And he worked hard and raised me in the suburbs, and I just took it all for granted and just, you know, and didn't really appreciate that story. And so finance is something I've had to come to later in life and stuff. And I'm a working class guy. And when my son, he's 27 now, when he was about 12, 13, my wife and I sat down and we consciously decided to go into debt because we were just getting by at the time. We're young parents, you know, and we wanted our son to have a decent childhood. And so we decided to go into credit debt, and we bought mountain bikes, and we became a mountain biking family. And because, you know, we didn't go to Hawaii, we didn't like, you know, go crazy. We just wanted to do something. So we, you know, and we'd go to Whistler for the holidays and ride there. And we decided after our son moved out of the house, we would try to tackle the debt. And we did that. We actually did that. And then we spent 5 years chipping away, and we actually paid off all the debt, and we actually saved a bunch of money at the same time. And this is pre-2020. And then, so I feel like we learned financial skills later in life, and we really dialed it in. And as working class people, you don't have a lot of disposable income. So you really know the money you're working with. And then those modern monetary theorists came out, and you know, and this is what gets me upset, is that I feel like as soon as they started talking and saying they could increase the money supply by up to 20%, and they could just cleverly put it in different places and it wouldn't cause inflation. And I remember I started arguing like right away with an economist friend of mine saying, this is going to hit the working class people hard. And then a year and a half later, that inflation hit, and nobody owned it. nobody, still to this day, I don't think they have acknowledged that their policies, are causing an inflation. And I've watched in the last 4 or 5 years, my disposable income just disappear. Like, it's just gone. And all my coworkers, same thing, it's just like people's cars break down and they're buying a used e-bike. People who just wanted to go to Mexico for 2 weeks in the winter haven't gone for 3 years now because they just can't afford it, And it's just, and we just had a federal election where I watched every politician stand up and, claimed the mantle of the working class. And I didn't see anybody talking about this issue, they talk about billionaires and they talk about this. And it's like, I feel like it's this monetary policy that just stripped me of all my disposable income. And I don't see it coming back anytime soon. And am I wrong in my evaluation of that? Am I misdirecting my frustration? Or is there, what is that modern monetary theorist doing to our economy?
No, I think you're absolutely spot on. And I think everyone, they feel it, but the problem is they haven't dug deep enough to understand what is the cause. And so, you know what, there's a really, the guy who founded Toyota, his name's like Tacoma, or it's not Tacoma, it's like Takoda or something like that. I always forget his name. Anyway, he always has this thing in his company called the 5 whys. And he's like, okay, if you're facing a problem, ask yourself, why am I facing this problem? You're going to get an answer. That answer is probably not the reason. Now you've got that answer, ask again, why is this the answer? You're going to get another answer. And then ask why again. And the 5 whys, the idea is it's not necessarily, alarm going off, it's not necessarily 5, it could be 7, it could be 3. But the idea is you want to keep digging until you get down to the root. And so most people, when they said, oh, we're facing inflation, it's a result of greedy corporations rising prices. And it stops there. Mm-hmm. And so then they blame capitalism. Mm-hmm. And reality, you've got to ask, okay, well, why are corporations rising prices? Well, the cost of goods is going up. So they have to sell the goods for higher. Why is the cost of goods going up? Well, the goods are made of resources. The cost of resources going up. Why is the resources going up? Because there's more demand. Why is there more demand? Well, there's more money. More money chasing the same amount of goods drives up prices. Why is there more money? The buck stops at the central bank. And so I think that the challenge is most people don't dig deep enough to understand the root cause. And so they misattribute the evildoer. And so I think that the challenge we face today, and it's a point that I really try and make in the book, is everything is downstream of money. Most of the time, politicians, they're playing in the symptoms. So it's like, if we've got a housing crisis, what are we going to do? We're going to give people, you know what? We're going to give you tax relief so you can actually go and buy your first-time home buyers program. You're going to get a discount. But what does that actually do? Well, now you've made people that wouldn't have gone and buy a house, now they're able to go and buy a house, which actually puts more pressure on housing, which drives up houses even further. And so we see it in Australia as well, where they have the first-time home buyers program and the government is willing to step in and provide up to 50% of the down payment. Well, now you've added more money into the system, which then means people that otherwise wouldn't have bought a house are now again buying houses, driving up house prices. And so many times when we intervene and we try and treat the symptom, we actually make it worse. But the problem is because people aren't willing to dig in, they keep on voting for the intervention. And so I think that the challenge that I see today, and I don't know what the statistic is in Canada, but I'm sure it's something pretty similar. But in the UK, 52% of individuals receive more in benefits than they pay in taxes. Mm-hmm. How can you have a society where more than half of the population receive more benefits than you pay in taxes? And what that means is immediately you've got a majority that will vote for more intervention because they benefit from that intervention. And that also means you've got a majority that aren't unfortunately able to think for themselves, because if they think for themselves and go against the government, they actually lose the subsidies and can't survive. And so it's how we fall into these traps of more and more and more fiscal irresponsibility and more government oversight and totalitarianism. And that's where it's just like when you have a society, if you want a strong, stable economy, what do you need? You need independent people that are sovereign and resourceful, because then they're willing to speak their voice, because they're not reliant on other people. Mm-hmm. And so I think the challenge is today we have this society where people are struggling so much that they're just going to continually vote for the person that says, I'm going to give you an extra $200 in your bank account every 2 months, or I'm going to give you this extra little stimulus, or this little subsidy, or childcare subsidy, or housing subsidy. And all of this stuff, unfortunately, is actually making life much, much, much harder for them. And it's just about, if we had a society that stepped back and realized it's actually this behavior that is making life harder, I think we'd be able to pivot trajectories. It's just we're not willing to question. I would add as well, like one of the analogies I give in terms of this intervention is like during the pandemic, most Canadians are aware of something called the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit.
Yeah.
And the CERB is really interesting because you would think, okay, there's a whole bunch of Canadians. We've basically just told everyone to stop working. So no one has any money. And then it's like, you know what? We're going to give you $2,000 a month if you've lost more than 10% of your income. $2,000 a month is $24,000 a year. $24,000 a year, 30% of Canadians earn under that, which means 1/3 of Canadians, you're basically just given the option, do you want to work or do you not want to work? And we're just going to pay you anyway. So of course they're going to take the latter. And in doing so, we basically had no one to work all of these low-income jobs, whether it is the bartender, whether it is the little cafe worker, whether it's the bike shop mechanic, whether you name it. All of these mum and pup stores struggled. And so I saw countless stores close through 2020, 2021 because we can't find staff. And so the idea behind, we want to support people, we're going to give people free money, it seems great on the surface, but the result is you actually destroyed all of the small businesses. And then because of all of that money entering the economy and people didn't have to work for it, people are a lot less conscious about how they spend it. So you end up with massive consumerism that drives up prices. We have massive inflation. And so again, it's like we have this habit of treating the symptom as opposed to treating the root cause. And I think the biggest thing about Bitcoin is that when you have a system with a fixed supply, one, over time with human ingenuity, even if we had full adoption, so ignore people coming in, which drives up Bitcoin's price. But as I mentioned earlier, even if we had full adoption of Bitcoin, prices would fall in the long term because humans always want to be more ingenious. They want to increase efficiency and productivity. But two, if the government doesn't control the money printer, if the only way that they can obtain funding is through taxes, then that means they have to be fiscally responsible. And it means they have to balance their books. And that means that they've got to be very conscious about where they spend that capital. And so if you've got a healthcare crisis, the answer is not print more money and fix the symptom. It is, you know what, maybe what is best is actually to look at this. How can we minimize our expense in the long term? And maybe that means going into the schools, educating people what a healthy lifestyle means, teaching people about the food we should be ingesting as opposed to all of the pharmaceuticals that we're consuming and all of just basically the malnourishment that we're getting from the food we're eating. And so I think that what's interesting is that when people are when people are forced to be fiscally responsible, they start thinking long term. When they start thinking long term, they start to dig down to the root to try and figure out the problem. And so I think that if the government didn't basically have access to a money printer, it forces them to be like any other small business. It forces them to be responsible and think about how to treat these problems from a root cause as opposed to a symptom solution.
Yeah, when you start to understand Bitcoin a bit, it seems like it does seem to represent like truth, integrity, accountability, just, values. You look at the way we're doing a monetary system now, and no one would run their household like that.
Totally.
No one would want to raise their children with these values, yet we just run right ahead with this. And it seems that, when the Bitcoin, and just countering what you were saying there, just in relation to the CERB policy, and I know friends who had to shut their business because they just couldn't find employees to run it during that time period. I think in your book, I think that you also said that government increased by, I think Canadian government grew by maybe 40%, but I think in your book you had the statistic of something like 87% of new job creations over the last 4 years were all government jobs, and there was almost no growth in the private industry. And so I guess that's perpetuating that, if it grows that much in that period, those are now people that are all dependent on this money, who are all going to vote probably that way. And I could see how this makes me think of South America and other countries that just keep voting once you get into hyperinflation, because so many people are dependent on it. Is there a tipping point where like you say, when Britain's at over 50% relying on government subsidies, how do you pull that back?
Well, what I think is really interesting is that there is a tipping point with every individual person. And that tipping point is where the pain of the existing system, staying in the existing system, outweighs the pain of change. And most people will stay in a system that's not serving them for a long time because to them, it's very painful to transition to a new system. And when we think about Bitcoin, what is painful about transitioning to Bitcoin? A lot of Bitcoiners are like, Bitcoin served me. My net worth has gone up. It's given me capacity. I can lean into family. It doesn't look like there's a lot of pain. But what Bitcoin does many times is exposes that the current system isn't working. The government doesn't have our best interest at heart. And I think that the hardest part about Bitcoin is actually recognizing that the system no longer serves us. The system is not supporting the individual. And I think that's the hardest part. It's actually breaking down our preconceived beliefs about how we think the world works, which is why, like, when we speak to a lot of like the boomer generation, they're just completely oblivious to what is going on because it's too painful for them to accept that actually maybe the government doesn't have my best interests at heart. And so it's a challenging one. I don't necessarily think that we are in Canada, in the UK, I don't necessarily think we're at the point where enough people are feeling the pain for mass change to take place.
It feels like a bit of a tough sell in the sense that it is dealing with truth. It is dealing with reality. It is dealing with accountability and paying the piper to a certain degree. And I think that, you know, the modern fiat system seems to be just pushing it down the line a little bit. Mm-hmm. And you can see how easy that could be, just like, because it does seem like there is a certain reckoning we would have to face if we wanted to, you know, be responsible and face these things, or we could just increase our budget by another 20 billion and print money. And so it seems like, you know, choosing that responsible path is a tough sell, but you know, if people could realize that you're just putting this on your grandkids, mm-hmm. you know, that'd be a different way of selling it, you know, but that the boomer generation, I think, is a tough sell because, you know, they've watched their real estate I don't know if this period's been bad for them. You know, it's, you know, I do feel sorry for people who go into retirement and they kind of have to throw their life savings into the stock market and hope it doesn't crash while they're, you know, it'd be nice if they could just, like you say, earn their money and then just let it appreciate in retirement. It seems crazy that we're getting retirees to risk their future in, you know, the stock market or in housing assets and stuff like that. It's, yeah, it doesn't seem very fair.
It's a challenge because I think that the way things are structured is that because our money is losing value, people are incentivized to go and chase yield. They're incentivized to go try and take risk in investing. And there's a big difference between saving and investing. We have a world now where we're pushed into investing, so we think of nothing else. Saving doesn't really exist. And so saving is the idea that, hey, I'm just going to save any excess purchasing power in the currency, and I'm just going to focus on my job, focus on whatever it is that interests me, and I'm just going to keep it in the bank account. And that's almost risk-free unless the bank goes under. Investing is very different. It's the idea of taking risk to try and amplify that return. But the problem is when money is losing value over time, we're now pushed into investing. So everybody and their dog has to spend their spare time. If you're a mechanic, if you're a doctor or whatever, you're now spending all your spare time trying to figure out the financial markets. What are these things? Yeah. So that I can just try and protect the purchasing power that I've made in my day job. And so people are tired because they're having to wear multiple hats. And I don't believe we need to be living in a society where everyone has to become a full-time investor. Yeah. And what I also believe is that the financial sector, which is one of the biggest sectors in the world, only exists because money is basically decimating our purchasing power. And so because it's decimating our purchasing power, we're looking to invest. So all of these financial products, all of these banks, all of these institutions have come out to try and solve this problem, but all of them are middlemen, and they take like snippets here and snippets there. They take a little bit of fees here and a little bit of fees there, and it just dwindles our purchasing power over time. And it also means that we have to continually put off our decision making onto so-called experts as well. The financial industry is too complex. Trust the experts. And then we see it or maybe taking a step back, I should say, we have this society where, because it's now become so complex and financialized, we're putting off all of our decision making on so-called experts, whether it is the financial experts, or it is our doctor, or it is the pharmaceutical companies, or it is the government. And I think that leads us into a very scary place where people aren't necessarily thinking for themselves.
This is the mass formation.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that term before until I read your book. Mm-hmm. That's what you're describing right now, I guess. Do you want to just quickly, briefly say what mass formation is?
Totally. And it's such a challenging one. I should say that these topics are so all interwoven, whether we're talking about money, whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about the individual, psychology, they're all so interwoven. And sometimes we start pulling on a thread and then it's just like, oh my God, where do I take this conversation? So I apologize about the train of thought sometimes going off on little tangents.
I can relate to, I think it's deserved, because I do think that there's a monomania that occurs. You talk to someone about water and it's just like being hydrated all the time is the most important. If you don't get enough sleep, that's the worst thing. And but I think Bitcoin actually is, I can see why it does what you're talking about, because it is touching everything. But sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I would say that, so there's a book that came out at the start of the pandemic, and it's called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And the guy who wrote it is the professor of psychology at Ghent University, and he's like the foremost expert in totalitarianism. And what he basically, through his research, has discovered is that there's 4 stages to totalitarianism. The first stage is loneliness. It's when we have a society where people are working so hard, they don't have much time to be able to go out and socialize. So there's kind of widespread loneliness. People are feeling socially isolated. And you could also argue in the modern day, that's because of technology. We've got social media that's kind of detracting us from society. And we feel like everyone else is doing great things but us. So there's kind of widespread loneliness. The second stage is meaninglessness. It's when we find that I don't have purpose. Life seems freaking hard. To save up for a house, I think it's going to take me 10 years. 5 years in, nope, it's going to take me 20 years. It's very easy for this meaninglessness to step in, because it's just like, what's the point? If I can't actually reach my goals, why should I even strive? And so that's kind of the second stage. The third stage is free floating anxiety. When you've got kind of this loneliness, when you've got this meaninglessness, it's really easy for this free floating anxiety to kick in, where it's just, you feel anxious, you feel stressed, but you can't quite attach it to anything. And that's very different from fixed anxiety. If I'm standing on the edge of a big rock face, I'm anxious because I have a fixed reason why. It's because I'm scared of heights and there's a massive rock face. Free floating, we can't quite understand why we're feeling anxious. And that finally leads into aggression and frustration. And I think when you have loneliness, meaninglessness, free floating anxiety, people start to get frustrated, they start to get aggressive. And there are countless studies that show, like there's studies on rats which show, like if you continually prod and frustrate a rat, it will start lashing out at its friends, even though its friends aren't the ones that are causing that frustration. And so you see this in society, in this social cohesion. It starts breaking down. We end up with a society where there's fights, there's social tension. You hear about kind of like fights breaking out, aggression, you name it. And so when all of these 4 things are met, it's very easy for a leader or a group, a cabal, to stand up and say the enemy is this. And people, because they have limited capacity, they're just trying to survive, they think, okay, well, if this is the enemy, we need to go after the enemy, and that's going to fix my free-floating anxiety. And this is when you end up with this mob formation that are willing to go against any of their values. They're willing to drop their kind of their moral compass to be able to try and relinquish this free-floating anxiety. And we've seen this so many times throughout history, whether it is Mao, and Mao talks about the intellectuals. The intellectuals are evil. What are you going to do? He killed 46,000 intellectuals, burnt all of the books, all of the universities, because the intellectuals were the people that were able to push back against his policies. What did he see with Stalin? Stalin was a lot of the farmers. It was the Christians. What do we see with Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il from North Korea? It was the capitalists. And so these aren't actually the enemy, but because these people are so frustrated and they're struggling and they don't have capacity, they just need anything that they think is going to fix it. And so it's really easy for these mob mentalities to form these cohesive masses. And as you mentioned, the mass formation to form, where people are willing to relinquish their rights, relinquish their values, to try and relinquish this sense of frustration and anxiety. But I would say, as I mentioned in the book, that I think there's one stage which the psychology of totalitarian in this book misses. And that stage is a precursor to these 4, and that is broken money. Because I think if you have sound money where people can preserve purchasing power, people can save, people can afford to be able to build a family and think about the future, it's very hard for loneliness and meaninglessness to kick in. And if it's very hard for those things to kick in, the second, third, fourth stage, it's almost impossible for them to kind of arise. And so I would argue that broken money that doesn't preserve purchasing power, ultimately leads to a lot of the totalitarian environments which we've seen throughout history. It's kind of been the precursor to the other 4 stages.
And so has sound money been relatively okay, maybe we should talk about the gold standard for people, just so that they understand how rare the moment we're at. Because does the gold standard arguably go back centuries?
Yeah, so gold, it's a tough one, because I think that first off, I should say a lot of our history has been doctored. Like, you only ever hear about history from the victors. So it's really hard to try and figure out, like, what is truth? money originated with actually like clay tablets, from what we understand when we look back through history. And these clay tablets would say, well, you know what, I've lent someone 20 bushels of hay, and I'm going to mark it and dock it down on here. And someone holds this clay tablet, and it's like a debt owing. And so in a sense, this is kind of like the first ever form of money. We're documenting debts owed to people back and forth. And then we started to see things like coinage appear. Well, actually, I should say before that, we saw seashells and we saw rye stones. We saw all of these commodity monies appear. But the problem with commodity monies is if there was not scarcity, you would end up seeing a devaluation. And so to give you an example, there may be scarcity of, say, glass beads because of the technology at the time in Africa. Glass beads were really hard to blow, so they used glass beads as the local currency. Well, the European settlers came into Africa and they were like, you guys are using glass beads as currency? Like, we can freaking make these en masse. So what did they do? They went and made them en masse, brought boatloads of glass beads down into South America, down into Africa, and that started the slave trade. It started the slave trade because they basically just hyperinflated the currency, which was glass beads, because the Africans couldn't make glass beads, but the Europeans could. So they bought up all of the locals, they bought up all of the resources. And a lot of people don't talk about how the African slave trade started. But that was kind of the problem with commodity money, is if you don't have scarcity, if someone else can access a resource better than you can, then eventually all of your ability to obtain resources is diminished. So then it led to, well, let's go try and find the scarcest form of resource. And that we kind of landed on gold. Gold is phenomenal because it's kind of uniquely scarce across all over the world. And gold lasted in many ways. It preserved its purchasing power incredibly well. But the problem with gold is, again, when we've got commodity money, it's physical in nature. So when it's physical in nature, you have to transport it. If you're transporting it in boats across oceans, well, what happens if the boat goes down? Then you lose all your gold. What happens if you want to do a trade and you've got to now, like an expensive trade, you've got to carry that gold to wherever the person is you're going to buy this thing off of. And what happens if you get robbed on the way? And so we started to see the evolution of banks. This is where people would go and deposit their gold at a bank. The bank would give them an IOU that says, hey, you've deposited whatever, 5 ounces of gold. And people realized that, you know what? It's easier to go and trade the IOUs than it is to go and trade the gold. But the banks realized no one was coming back for their gold. So then they started to issue more gold than they had in reserve. Sorry, more IOUs than they had in reserve. And so eventually you get these bank runs where people are like, hey, I want my gold back. And the bank didn't have the gold. And so we started to see the decay of the gold system. And that ultimately led to, I would say the big pivotal moment was like 1971 in the US, where we kind of transitioned to the fiat currencies. They're no longer backed by gold. The US didn't want to honor its gold redeemability, and President Nixon dropped the gold standard altogether, and that's purely fiat. Money is worth its value because the government says so, and it's basically backed by debt and US military. And so that's kind of this transition we've seen throughout history. But what I would say is we have seen periods where gold currencies maintained purchasing power for long periods of time. There was a period, I think it's called like the Florentine in Florence, where there's something like, and don't quote me on this, it's like 400 years, they had incredible prosperity. They had incredible prosperity because they didn't devalue the currency. They didn't print more than they had. And so it ended up creating a period of massive thriving. What's also interesting is when you look at the US, there was a period from, I think it was around 1860 to 1910. It was 1913, which is the invention of the Federal Reserve, the central bank. But 1860 to 1910, it was a great period of depression. Deflation, not depression. Great period of deflation. And what we saw out of that was the Industrial Revolution. We saw the rise of the middle class. We saw the rise of the automobile. We saw the rise of electricity. We saw the rise of the Edison bulb. We saw the rise of all of these technologies and the absolute boom in industry. And some people attribute that to a deflationary period, where because the money was backed by gold, and people were being innovative, we saw prices fall, and it made life easier. People went out there and they created change in society because they had capacity to do so.
Right. Okay. Well, and so I think you had an image in your book that it was kind of the US dollar bill, maybe 3 of them, just showing that transition where it literally said on the bill, like, this is redeemable for gold essentially, or it represents. And then after 1971, it's basically like, this is a piece of paper. It's and not tied to anything there at all, I guess. And so we are in a period where I think you also mentioned that banks always had to keep a certain reserve in their bank, but you said, I think since 2020 that banks had gotten rid of that as well, that they could just didn't have to have a certain amount of in reserve anymore.
Totally. And this was one of the reasons why the gold standard was dropped, is essentially the banking system evolved into what's called a fractional reserve banking system. And a fractional reserve banking system basically was saying that, hey, if you've got a bank, you need to keep a certain amount in reserves. Let's say it's 10%. 10% has been kind of a historical average. Well, if you're keeping 10% in reserves, that means if I go and deposit $100 into the bank holds $10 of my money, then goes and lends out 90. Now, if that person who receives the 90 deposits that 90 back into the bank will hold $9 and then go and lend out $81. And so you can see from an initial $100, you end up with like $1,000+ in circulation now. And so it's a fractional reserve system, which then results in bank runs. If people go to the bank to withdraw their money, their value, the bank cannot honor it. They don't have enough money in reserve. And so it creates a very unstable system. And so what's interesting is when you look at the banknotes, and it's the chart you're referring to, there's three little dollar bills. One is it's around like 1930s and before. One is 1930s, 1971. One is 1971 onwards. And what you see in the pre-1930s is it says this bill is redeemable for its weight in gold. So you can go and take that bill to the bank and they give you its weight in gold. And that was phenomenal, except the government going into the Depression, well, they wanted to start bailing things out. The Federal Reserve wanted to start bailing institutions out. So they didn't have money to do so. So they started running this fractional reserve system far more aggressively than they have done previously. And as a result, if people came and tried to withdraw their gold, they didn't have the gold. So what they did is they then changed the note. It's no longer redeemable for gold, but it's worth its weight in gold. And so this gold, this note, although it's backed by gold, you can't actually go and get the gold. And on top of that, from what was it? I've completely blanked on the year, but there was Executive Order 6102 in around the kind of like 30s and 40s, where the government basically said average individuals are no longer allowed to hold gold. And so they actually had like an amnesty of sorts, where basically people handed over their gold to the government. The government bought it off them for half the actual going market rate. Right. And this allowed the government to go and spend immensely. And this is how they fuel a lot of these wars, is they needed access to gold, but they couldn't because they were restricted, because they needed a certain amount in reserve. So they basically just went and prevented average individuals from holding gold. They then took in all of this gold and then went and spent fund war. And so anyway, that was a period up until 1971. And then 1971 onwards, it basically just, I think it says this is a complete blank on the wording, but it's no longer attached to gold. There's no tie to gold whatsoever. You can print money as much as you want. And so since then, we've just seen absolute inflation in asset prices and cost of living, you name it, and rent. And and I think that you could argue that is why in Canada, we've seen from 1970, the average house in Canada was 3 times the average person's wage. Well, today it's 9.7 times. Yeah. And that is average across all of Canada. If you take places like Squamish, so I live in Squamish, just north of Vancouver, we're kind of in the Sea to Sky Highway where it's very desirable. And the average wage is like $36,000 a year. Well, the average house, it's like $2 million. Yeah. And so it's not even close to 9 times. It's closer to 50 times. And so I think the challenge we face today is that money has just been devalued so much. There's so much money in circulation, chasing after a finite amount of goods and services, that we're just seeing absolute inflation in purchasing power or in prices.
So what's the steel man for the fiat system? Like, if Mark Carney, he's a central banker. I had never heard of the Bank of International Settlements either until I read your book, and I did some looking, and and Prime Minister Carney was involved with the Department of International Settlements. If you sat down with him, what would he be saying why we need to be doing this? Is it like to get through crises? Like, when a crisis hits, we need to be able to print money to be able to get through it. Is like, well, what's the steelman version for why the fiat system is better than a deflationary system?
It's a challenging one, because like if you put yourself in the shoes of someone like Mark Carney, and let's just say he does have the best interests of the economy at heart. And he's just looking at it through a different lens. Let's just pretend there is no cabal or group of individuals that maybe they have their own incentive to do other things. Let's just assume he's looking at it from the economic perspective. He wants to support the economy. You could argue that when the government controls the money printer, when the government and the central bank are in cahoots, what it enables them to do is, if you have a small centralized team, that they're able to do the research and they know what is best for the economy above and beyond the mass of individuals. They know what is best, so they can target change in the economy by printing capital and directing that capital into the economy. So it's like very targeted change in the economy, and that's how you create a functional society. On top of that, you could argue that going into recessionary periods, depressionary periods, the challenge is capital starts to dry up. Because if you've got all of these businesses and all of a sudden people stop spending, and those businesses have debt obligations to meet and they're not receiving capital, then we start to see a massive deflationary shock in society, and capital starts to dry up. There's a limited amount of capital, and the central bank can come in and start to stimulate the economy. They can start to inject capital into the society, and that lubrication of capital in the society helps to prevent these massive defaults. And so that's usually what they argue, is that you need a central bank to be able to keep an economy functioning long term. Otherwise, you're going to get massive defaults. You're just going to get crises. It's going to be hard to function as a society. But you play the flip side of that, and you could argue that, as Ray Dalio talks about in his book, like what is it, the big debt cycle. He talks about how typically in a free market, you're going to always get the business cycle where you get periods of growth and then periods of contraction. And during these periods of growth, people start to get overzealous and they start taking on debt because they're seeing growth. But then all of a sudden, as they start taking on debt, if they see any decline in their sales, they can no longer service that debt, and so they start to struggle and they start to default. But what that defaulting does is it wipes out fiscal irresponsibility. So the companies that borrowed beyond their means basically get wiped out, while the companies that lived within their means and put aside savings prosper. So you end up with a society long-term that ends up stabilizing because people are incentivized to actually think about the future and put aside a savings vehicle and not take on too much debt or borrow beyond their means. The challenge we face today is that when we start to get that growth, and then we start to see it roll over and we start to see the contraction and the defaults, we step in. We lower interest rates, which incentivizes debt consumption, and we stimulate the economy with subsidies and stimulus, which then preserves these companies that have been fiscally irresponsible, so they borrow more, and then we go into another period of growth. But we've not actually wiped clean the fiscal irresponsibility. We've propped it up. We've rewarded them. And so then we end up going into a system with even more fiscal irresponsibility. And so what Ray Dalio talks about is you get these cycles where you end up with 4 or 5 of these in a row every 7 to 8 years. And then every kind of 70 years or so, you end up with a massive depression, because unfortunately there is just too much debt, too much fiscal irresponsibility, that even the injection of capital can no longer sustain that. And what's really interesting is what we've seen over time is the law of diminishing returns with the injection of capital and taking on debt. Like initially, if you've got a society with very little debt, if you go and take out debt and stimulate and inject it into the economy, you see huge growth from it. But eventually, when you've got so much debt, an additional dollar of debt doesn't stimulate the economy. It actually does the opposite. Now you've got the interest to pay on that debt. So you actually take on more burden by taking on more debt. You're no longer stimulating the economy to actually benefit. And we've seen, there's a chart in the book again that looks over all of these kind of nation states, whether it's China, whether it's US, whether it's globally. And we've seen, I think it was something like in China, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, for every dollar of debt we took out, it ended up doing something like $1 or $1.40 change in the economy. Well, today it's doing like $1.17. And so at a certain point, for $1 of debt, it's only going to create change of 90 cents, 80 cents, 70 cents. And it's that point that actually debt is more burdensome than the stimulus it which creates. And so that's that tipping point that we're talking about, taking on too much debt.
Right, wow. Okay. And so what's a deflationary world look like? So
this is a challenging one because, again, we've had very few periods throughout history where we can actually historically document deflation. One of those is going from kind of like the mid to late 1800s, or I always get, you know what I should say, maybe this is just my friggin' dyslexia. To me, it is dumb that it's called the 18th century when we're
In the
referring to
1700s.
the 1700s.
Yeah, it's always the one before when you say
always,
it. Yeah.
and I'm always like, this is backwards.
Yeah.
Okay, so from 1850-60 to 1910, what we saw is arguably a period of deflation. And from that, as I mentioned, we saw huge amounts of growth with the Industrial Revolution, rise of the middle class and such. But outside of that, there has not been that much documented periods of deflation because we've always been intervening. And our system has never allowed us to create a monetary system that prevents intervention. And so that's what I would argue Bitcoin does, is Bitcoin creates a monetary system that is scarce, so it benefits from human ingenuity. Basically, it's a forcing function for deflation. Prices fall over time. Bitcoin's price rises over time. Things get cheaper in Bitcoin. On top of that, because it is decentralized, no single entity control the issuance and the rule set, which is unbelievably important. And on top of that, it's trustless, which means you don't have to, if you don't want to, rely on middlemen and intermediaries that can govern where you do and don't spend your money, which is really, really important. And so I think because of this, I think it's a forcing function for a free market. It's a forcing function for deflation, where people who own Bitcoin can spend money where they see fit. They can direct capital to where they see value in society, and no one can tell them otherwise, which is phenomenal. And secondly, I think if people start to have an increase in purchasing power over time, and we start to see this deflationary shock throughout society, what I think it is going to do is there's going to be a lot of pain in the short term. It's kind of like the heroin addict is going to have withdrawals if he wants to get off heroin. When we're in a debt-based system, we're going to have withdrawals to get off debt. And what that means is because we've lived beyond our means for so long, we've borrowed to be able to stabilize ourselves and survive. We've got to live within our means, well within our means for a long period of time. And I think what Bitcoin does is that's a forcing function that forces us to live within our means. But as our purchasing power increases over time, I think that's going to have huge ramifications, positive ramifications on our behavior, how we interact with one another, our psychology, parenting, all of these aspects. And so maybe I'll touch on a couple. First off, consumption. If our purchasing power is increasing over time as opposed to decreasing, well, now we're incentivized to save as opposed to consume. There's always going to be consumption. People are always still wanting to want to survive. And so I think that people are just going to be a lot more conscious about where they direct their capital. And so if there's less capital going towards consumption, companies that are offering poor quality products are going to wither away. Those who are offering better quality products are going to survive. So I think we're going to see an increase in the quality of products and probably an increase in the sustainability of products and where the resources are being sourced from. But what about on the parent side of things? If you're two parents trying to support your kids, at the moment, life is getting harder and harder and harder. Well, in a Bitcoin world, over time, prices get cheaper. Life gets easier. To put a roof over your heads becomes easier. And so all of a sudden you start to have more capacity. As you have more capacity, you can spend more time with your kids. And so I'd be willing to bet that over time what we would see is we'd see a reduction in depression, anxiety, substance abuse, all of these things which are coping mechanisms because kids aren't having their emotions met, their emotional needs met. And so I think it really starts to repair the parent-child bond, which was seen like a breakdown in society as a result of kind of the last 5-10 years and the challenge of broken money, social media and things like that. And then I think you're also going to see it on the government side of things. I think that the challenge we face today in government is because they have a money printer, there's no incentive for them to listen to the populace. They can kind of do whatever they want, whenever they want, because it's just like if you start up a business, if you start up, a candy store, but out back, you have a money printer, are you incentivized to actually sell the best candy or create an enticing store? You're not, because ultimately you can fund operations without support from your customers. Well, it's the same thing with government. The government should be representing the people. And if it's not representing the people, it should quickly wither away. And a government that stands up for the people is going to support the people. But we don't have that because they have a money printer. They can fund operations without support. So I think what Bitcoin does by separating money and state is the government becomes a business like every other business. It has to offer value to society. And if it doesn't, and people decide, I'm going to stop paying taxes, well, then all of a sudden the government can't fund operation. It withers away and another one rises up. And so I think it shifts the incentives on a political side of things. And we can talk about so many different areas of society, but essentially whether it's politics, whether it is the parent-child bond, whether it's consumerism, you start to see these repercussions as a result of deflation where prices fall over time, life starts to get easier, that I think realign the incentives in society. And that is what I think is just truly profound. It incentivizes saving. It incentivizes fiscal responsibility. It disincentivizes debt consumption. Because if your purchasing power is increasing over time, the other way you could think about it is if you've got debt, it's going to become harder to pay that debt. So
Right.
people are going to be a lot more conscious about taking on debt. Companies are going to put a lot more skin in the game before they start taking on investors and all of this kind of stuff. And so I think that it's going to create a lot more stable society in the long term.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And that stuff's all very exciting, but just curious about the practical stuff too. Like what does rent look like? What does your wage look like? Like does it just, you know what I mean? Like right now,
Totally.
yeah, we get like small rent increases and little wage increases. So would your wage just stay the same because your purchasing power arguably is going to get better every year, or would you have to give a rent decrease to your landlord every once in a while? Like what's the actual practical, realities look like that way?
Totally. And so I'd touch on wages to start. Wages is a really interesting one because there's something in economics called the stickiness of wages. And what that basically means is it is usually the employee, it's on their back to go try and ask for a raise in wages. And the employer isn't really incentivized to raise wages because it's increasing their cost. But they're always raising their prices because we're experiencing inflation and the increase in resources and the cost of goods to be able to provide those services is always increasing. And so it's always on the employee to be able to try and increase their wage. And so there's always this tension between the employee and the employer. And because of that, prices tend to rise at a much faster rate than what wages do. Wages just have not caught up. The lagging stickiness of wages, you can see it, as I mentioned, like house prices have gone from 3 times the average person's wage to 9.7 times over the last kind of 40, 50 years. It's cost of living. Cost of living in relation to wages has gone from friggin' 5% of your wage to 40, 50% of your wage just to be able to survive.
Those are some of the most depressing charts to look at.
Totally. And it's just where wages are not keeping up with the rise in prices. And what would be interesting is it would be the inverse, where now the employee, if the wage just stays stationary while prices are falling, they're effectively getting a wage increase because their purchasing power is increasing. Yeah. So now it falls on the employer. And so I think you'll get the reverse. You get a stickiness of wages, but in the other direction. So prices would fall faster than the wages would be keeping up those falling prices, which effectively means you're still getting a wage increase over time. Right, and so I think it's just the inverse of our current system is what I believe.
Right, I see. And so the pressure would be on the employer to see if, like, because you might be making too much money now because of the deflationary pressures. And
totally.
But so you're flipping it. That's interesting.
And you know what? Like, there's a guy in Bitcoin who I heard about this story, and from what I know, it's true. There's a guy who works for one of the big Bitcoin corporations or Bitcoin companies, and in around 2014, 2015, he said, for the next 10 years, I want 100 Bitcoin a year as my wage. Well, at the time, when Bitcoin was sub $1,000, 100 Bitcoin a year was $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year. Yeah. And so the company was like, yeah, no worries at all. Luckily, the company had the foresight to recognize that they think Bitcoin was going to go up. So they pre-bought all the Bitcoin. But now that wage, when Bitcoin is at 100,000 plus US dollars a Bitcoin, right. And he's getting paid 100 Bitcoin a year, that's $10 million.
How smart of the company to pre-buy the Bitcoin.
100%.
That was good.
That's an example of, like, over time, his wage has stayed stationary. It's been 100 Bitcoin, but because Bitcoin's purchasing power has increased, his ease of life has dramatically increased. And so, like, what we've seen in Canada is, like, from 2014 to 2024, so across a 10-year period, the average house has gone from, in Canada, from like 400 and like, it was saying like 417,000 Canadian dollars to 720. So it's almost doubled across Canada over the last kind of 10 years. When Bitcoin, it's gone from 1,054 Bitcoin to 8.
Right.
So during that same period, you've seen a 99% drop in house prices when you price them in Bitcoin. And so people sometimes struggle to think about the fact that, like, if you're saving in the fastest growing asset like Bitcoin, that what you could flip that and say everything is falling in relation to Bitcoin. And so whether it's your cost of living, the food you're buying, whether it's you're paying for your rent, whether it's you're buying a house, whether you're trying to buy a mountain bike, everything else is falling in relation to Bitcoin. So life's getting easier. And that is possible. Everyone is able to benefit from this if Bitcoin was a global standard.
Yeah, that sounds very promising. I'll start thinking about wrapping up here. Seb, is there anything else you wanted to say specifically about the Bitcoin world here to maybe some first-time hearers of Bitcoin?
You know what? Like, I would say that you kind of need like 2 to 3 touch points to really start to get curious. And I would say try not to just dismiss Bitcoin for this kind of get rich quick scheme, crypto bros, because underneath this get rich quick scheme, crypto bro thing, what you actually realize is this is a human rights tool. It is a tool that preserves people's purchasing power over time and hopefully grows people's purchasing power and allows them to express what they value monetarily without interference from the state, without interference from intermediaries. And so to me, I see it as like the ultimate free speech tool. If you want to go and support someone in what they believe, you can direct capital towards them without interference. Like what we saw during the trucker rally at the start of the pandemic, when all of the truckers, they didn't agree with what the government was doing. So they stood up and they protested. Well, their bank accounts were shut down, which impeded their ability to protest and voice what it is they believed. So we don't really have free speech if the government is impeding people from speaking by freezing their bank accounts, preventing them from doing so. Well, Bitcoin was the only way that people were able to get money to the truckers because it was a system independent of government. And it was a decentralized system that was trustless. You didn't have to rely on intermediaries. And so it allowed people to basically support themselves and stay true to what it is that they believe in. And so Bitcoin to me is like the ultimate sovereignty tool, but you need to step back from a lot of the media narratives around Bitcoin kind of boiling the oceans and Bitcoin is used for illicit activity and Bitcoin is this and Bitcoin is that. Because actually, all I will say is like when you dig into these, and it's a much bigger discussion, when you dig into these, you realize that most of these are false. Most of them have been used to propagate fear against Bitcoin and push back against Bitcoin, when in reality, it could not be further from the truth. And so I think that Bitcoin in the end, it took me many years to really grok it. Most people go into Bitcoin for its number go up technology, which basically means most people go into Bitcoin because it increases in price over time. So it's going to protect their portfolio a little bit. Maybe it's going to make life a little easier. And then they stay for the revolution because they realize actually Bitcoin is the thing that can potentially overthrow the system. The thing that can actually move us towards a system that supports the individual, gives us back sovereignty, gives us back control. And so for me, if there's kind of one final thing I'll say, it is that like to me, what I think is so incredible about Bitcoin is even though it's digital money, it gets us to stop thinking about money. Because as our money starts increasing in purchasing power over time, life starts to get easier. And as we start to have more capacity, we can start to focus on what matters most, which is our family, our community, challenging ourselves, our hobbies. And that's what really matters in life. What doesn't matter is constantly figuring out how am I going to support myself financially? How am I going to preserve my purchasing power? Where am I going to make money? Like that kind of stuff is frustrating and it's a result of broken money. And so the irony of Bitcoin being digital money is it gets us to stop thinking about money. And so to me, Bitcoin is like a spiritual tool. It basically grounds society in having more capacity to show up more authentically.
That's awesome. And do you have anywhere you have the hidden cost of money? Your book. You also have the Through the Looking Glass. Is that your organization? Is that what it's called?
Yeah. So the book, The Hidden Cost of Money, and there's another one called Beers for Bitcoin. The Hidden Cost of Money kind of talks about obviously the hidden costs to the fiat system, the system we use today, and ultimately what would a solution be? And I obviously argue for Bitcoin. And then there's another book called Beers for Bitcoin, which is more about if you're kind of a little down the rabbit hole and you want to understand how Bitcoin actually functions, like what is the role of miners and nodes in Bitcoin. It's kind of very much a book that explains how Bitcoin functions for the layperson. And then I've also got The Looking Glass. The Looking Glass is kind of an educational platform that's really focused again on material for the layperson. And I founded that with a few really inspiring individuals. And our whole goal was just like, how do we support the average working class individual? How do we support the single mum? How do we support kind of the plumber, the technician, and understanding why they're feeling the effects of society which they're feeling today? And then my day job, I work for a company called Block Rewards that's based out of Kelowna. And our whole goal is Bitcoin payroll solutions. So we want to get people paid in Bitcoin, whether they want to put 5% of the paycheck, 10%, they can do that because we feel like that's the easiest way to get people on board is get people to start getting paid in Bitcoin. And ultimately, I really appreciate you having me on. And I never want price to be a barrier for education. And so if anyone listening to this is curious about Bitcoin, curious about the book that I wrote, if you can't afford the book, just reach out to me at Seb Bunney, Bunney, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's on my website, sebbunny.com. And I'll more than happy send you the ebook for free. I just want people to be able to have an understanding about like why they experience the issues they do in society, why they're struggling to get by. And I think most importantly, you've got to meet people where they're at and talk about things from their own perspective. So if it's a single mum or the dad, trying to understand, why am I spending less time with my kids? Why can't I meet their needs to the extent I might be able to? If you're a politician, it's understanding like, why is society breaking down? If you're an economist, it's just like trying to understand, why is the money we're using not serving us? And so really trying to talk to all of these different points for different individuals.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Seb, for everything you did, all your works. That's great. I can test. The book is very readable, very approachable. I can recommend it to anyone as an entry point. I think it's fabulously written. Thanks for coming on Bad Canadians. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Jared. I really appreciate you having me on, and I'm looking forward to chatting more.
All right, sounds good. All right, have a good rest of your night. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe or share with your friends. Bad Canadians, Working Class Roots, A Free Speech Lens, and Canadian Contrarians.